Hi, this is Boki, and today for my grad student, not my thesis vlog, I wanted to go through basically each of the years of grad school and talk about why each of them suck in ways that are specific to that year. And I wanted to do this for few reasons. The first one is just that I think grad students love to complain, and I am no exception. The other thing is I thought it would just be kind of helpful for people who aren't familiar with how grad school, or specifically PhD programs in a science engineering type field work. This might be just like a way to kind of get through a lot of the different procedures that are in place to make our lives happen. There is variation in between programs, both depending on the field that you're in and as well what school you're at, but I think a lot of the principles are kind of the same. Your first year of grad school is basically the year that you are figuring out what you're going to spend the next 5-ish years of your life doing, and it's basically super because you're deciding on a job, but you're also deciding on a job that's almost like your family. You are picking your advisor, they're basically your pseudo parent for a long time. You're picking a lab, you're picking people who are gonna be your colleagues, but also the people that you depend on for emotional support, because they are the only people who truly understand what you're working on and care and understand why you are sad that it doesn't work. So first year is kind of basically the most important thing is finding your lab. So some schools you come in having already picked a lab and you start working on it right away. Other schools like mine, you do rotations, so you basically spend a few weeks working in a lab, a few months actually, working in a lab, getting a sense of the lab culture, learning about some of the projects, and you do this throughout the year, and by the end of the year you pick your lab. And even though you are taking classes at the same time, your rotations are really the most important part of your first year if you're at a school like this. And as a result, they are also kind of super stressful. So I was actually someone who, I don't know that I did rotations in the most correct manner. I probably went about it in the most stressful way, in that by the end of the school year, I still did not have a lab, which is really scary because most people by that time have picked a lab, will join it over the summer. I went into the summer still doing a rotation because I just had no idea where I was going to work. And yeah, there's a lot of stakes to it, because if you don't find a lab, it's kind of well, guess you don't do grad school anymore, you don't have a PhD program to follow through on. I don't know, it's kind of scary. At the same time, the other big part of your first year, at least for us, are qualifying exams. That's another thing that varies from school to school. We have qualifying exams at the end of our first year that are an oral examination on different subjects you take through the year, as well as a topic related to your research. So you are taking these huge exams that basically decide if you get to continue in the program, and you also have to find a lab, which also determines if you're going to get to continue in the program. And it's these two huge things, and it's just super scary because you're also, at least in my case, this is the first time that I've really been completely on my own. College, you're kind of on your own, but not really. You're kind of in a bubble, at least that was my experience. Grad school, it's the first time that I'm completely on my own, having to figure out how to be a grown-up and all of this stuff. So doing all of these things at once was a little bit terrifying, and it was actually pretty tough for me. I'll probably do kind of another episode or another vlog a little bit more down the road about mental health, but my first year for me was incredibly rough for both anxiety and depression, because I just had no idea what I was doing. I did not know who I wanted to work for. I did not know what I was doing in grad school. I couldn't manage kind of basic adult things, or I could, but I was just so scared of them that I would put them off. So yeah, first year is basically a crisis of identity, of oh shit, I'm here, what do I do now? And some people it's not as big of a deal, they kind of come in knowing who they want to work for, but other people, you come in, you think you know who you want to work for, you do the rotation, you find out that the lab is not what you thought it was, and you're oh crap, what now? The other issue is finding labs with funding. A lot of PIs, they rely on grants, and if they don't have a grant at that time to fund a student, they're not going to be able to take you on. So that's another thing that can come up if you think you know who you're going to work for, but then they don't have money. That's really stressful. You can apply for fellowships and all that stuff, but then you're kind of at the mercy of foundation, NSF, and like, so this takes us into second year, and by your second year, you have to have a lab. I mean, you've passed your qual, so you're good. You have a lab, so you're good. Until you're like, okay, yay, like I have an identity, I know what I'm doing in grad school, except you still don't, because you have to have a project. And the problem is that nobody knows how your projects are going to work. Like, nobody knows what projects will work, how long they're going to take. So basically, your second year, you are throwing a bunch of darts at a dartboard and hoping that one will stick. And that's a lot of work. This might be more particular to biology, but I'm guessing this is true for a lot of fields. But like in a biology field, especially like a micro field where you're dealing with bacteria, you're very much on their schedule. But you're doing all of this really for the sake that something will work. But you're also learning how to do a lot of these techniques, which means that a lot of the first few months that you're there, you're just the problem. Like everything that you need to troubleshoot is probably you. It's not a science thing. It's not an experimental failure, it's an experimenter failure. I don't know if that makes sense, if that's really that distinct. In my case, I didn't know that you shouldn't be putting certain chemical in the incubator because it will kill all the rest of the cells around it. That was an experiment that took me 3 tries before we realized what I was doing wrong. I've seen this manifest basically in every student who goes through the lab, where you think that you know that you don't know how to do something, but the only thing you can do is just start the experiment and figure out afterwards what it is you don't know. So your second year, I feel like that's the year where everyone is kind of at their most tired because you're trying so many different experiments and so many different types of projects that you can't focus on any single one. So it's really stressful, both because of the time that you're spending and because you don't have like your project, like you don't actually have that complete sense of like, this is what I'm going to be working on for the next few years, this is what I'm going to propose for my thesis work. So it's just like a weird different type of identity crisis where it's like, okay, now I've narrowed it down, but I didn't actually, because there's like 50 million things that I can do in this field. And basically as a second year, any new project will probably go to you because you're the one with the most, kind of seems like the most free time, you're the most easily distractible because your advisor is also trying to find you a project that will land. So third year is, I think, probably universally acknowledged as one of the shittiest years of grad school. And I don't know that it's a specific thing. I think like at that point you should have your project, you have your lab, you should have your project, so you kind of know what you're doing. And now this is like when the reality sets in that like most of what you're working on in grad school is not going to amount to anything, and that you have no idea what you're going to do with any of the skills or the work or whatever that you've put in and taken out of grad school. And it just kind of hits you all at once because you probably came into grad school with like some grand idea of like what you're going to accomplish. Like I think people go into grad school knowing that it's going to be hard. Like no one goes in, I think, thinking that they're going to cure cancer or anything, because that would be ridiculous and highly unlikely. But I think people come in to grad school with at least some mild optimism that like things will be kind of okay. But you get to third year and you realize that your definition of okay has like been constantly adjusted over the past few years. Like first you're like, okay, I just like need to have a project and it'll work and be meaningful and I'm gonna be happy. And then you realize like, oh, well, I want it to be meaningful, but maybe I can kind of waver on that as long as it works. But then it works and you're like, well, but why doesn't it matter anymore? Why does nobody gonna care? Like no one's gonna care about this one small molecule I've been working with. I'm putting all of my time into like some experiment and no, it's not gonna even be published. Like it's just like a weird like existential crisis of like, how does science get done and what is your role in science, and like why are there so many people who do so much science and it doesn't seem to matter. Like you just realize that every contribution is small and so is yours. Like the number of people who make immense, huge contributions to science is incredibly tiny, and no matter how smart you are, the likelihood that you're going to be one of them is also going to be incredibly tiny. And this doesn't sound like, I think it doesn't sound like as concrete of stress compared to like the first and second years where it's like, oh my god, what lab am I going to be in? And, or like second year where it's like, oh my god, what project am I going to be working on? But I think that makes it even worse because it's really just like 2-3 years worth of like stress building up into pure crisis of like, why am I here? So yeah, and it's also like your mid grad school slump. Like you don't have the excitement of just starting, and you don't have the promise of hopefully soon ending. So it's just like you in the middle of it, just being like, what the f. And fourth year is either a continuation of your third year stress, or kind of like a nice break. I think like by the time I got over the residuals of my third year crisis, it was like, okay, fourth year is kind of nice. Like I feel like I got a handle on grad school, which kind of makes the fifth year crisis even worse because you're like, you have a few months where you're like, oh yeah, like I got this figured out. Like I've gotten through my third year, my mid grad school slump. Like I'm gonna be good. And then you get into fifth year and you realize that you're supposed to try to graduate, but you don't know when that's gonna happen. But everyone has started asking you, like, when are you gonna graduate? And you're like, no clue. Like, everyone's like, you've been in grad school for a while. And you're like, yeah, but, you know, it'll happen. And then over the course of a few months, you're like, but is it gonna happen? Like, am I really gonna graduate? Like, do I really know what I'm doing? The answer is probably no. You also have to start thinking more concretely about what you want to do after grad school. Are you going to stay in academia? Are you going to apply for industry? And some people come into grad school like knowing like, absolutely I am not doing academia, and I kind of envy that because it's like, that's great. Like, you know that you're not going to want to stay, you know that you can potentially just apply for jobs right out of grad school. Like, there's still a lot of uncertainty there, but at least you kind of have a whole subset of stuff eliminated. And it's a huge subset. Continuing in academia is an immense prospect. You're also just trying to see, like, will my project actually wrap up? Like, can I make a thesis out of this? And will my advisor let me graduate? There's a lot of variation between advisors. I'm lucky to have an advisor who is very encouraging and trying to get me to graduate. If anything, I'm the one who's like maybe on this like kind of holding back. But I know of a lot of people who have to really compromise with their advisors and like really work towards saying like, no, I want to be gone by this point. Like, I want to be applying for jobs at this point. Like, all of like these considerations that your advisor might not be taking into account because their main goal is to like push out more papers. And so when they have you potentially doing really good work for them or like completing a certain project, their incentives are not necessarily in line with yours. And that's fine, but it's like, it's not a bad thing about advisors. It just means that it's something that you kind of have to negotiate around. And sometimes that can be really hard. I think some people have tougher advisors who are really taking advantage of them. I think that's less likely, but I think it's more that it's just a mismatch and you just need to kind of find that compromise, but I do think it is a hard thing to navigate. So yeah, fifth year is really just a crisis of being old and like feeling like you need to graduate and everyone's reminding you that you need to graduate and being like, yeah, I want to graduate too, but science is science, I don't know when it's gonna happen. And you're like, at this point some of your friends might be starting to graduate and you're comparing yourself to them, which is the worst part. Never compare yourself to anyone in grad school because that's gonna be like, I mean, you probably shouldn't do that in general. Like, I think that's generally good life advice, but like, yeah, grad school is like a terrible idea because everyone's working on different projects, so you can't really compare. There's like not like a standard, like different fields have different outputs. That's fifth year. Sixth year, I mean, is basically the same thing as fifth year, except I feel like now I'm just kind of like, well, like, when it happens, it happens. When I graduate, it'll happen. So in that sense, it's less of a crisis and more just a grudging acceptance that it might take me some time to be done and leave and whatever. I don't know, maybe there'll be another sixth year crisis that I'm going to experience this year. We'll see. It'll probably unfold over the course of this vlog. I think the only crisis I can think of now is that there are people who are fifth years who are not me, and for some reason that's the weirdest one to me. Like, that there are people who are younger than me in grad school time who are thinking about graduating or on the verge of that graduation crisis while I still have not graduated. Actually, I like on my blog I had kind of a series about this, but I never finished it, so I thought it would be more fun of tape or to kind of do this vlog about it instead, just to give an idea of a lot of the different parts of grad school.